Yes, yes. Okay, so I thought I would do a little video taking a look at the making of Atmospheric Jungle using a track from my latest release entitled Last Light as the basis. So let's take a little listen to the track and then take it from there. Okay, so got a feel for the track there. Okay, let's get right into it. So I think the first thing which I think is worth thinking about when you're wanting to make an Atmospheric Jungle track is the most important thing fundamentally is the sound selection. Like what sort of sounds, what sort of story do you want to build? Is it going to be more laid back, more melodic? Is it going to be, are you going to have a sort of significant change halfway through the track? Like, for example, the likes of PFM and the sort of classic good looking sound, PFM specifically, you'll get like, say 4 or 5 minutes into his tune, and then you'll get like the best bit of the track. You'll get a couple of new melodic sounds will come in and they'll sort of light up the track. And when every time you listen to it, you always stay listening to it because you know that bit's coming. And so I think arrangement and sound selection go hand in hand, and it's worth having a little pre-think about what sounds you might want to go when you sort of wanted to make an atmospheric track. Could be a sample, could be just a little something, but having at least one, possibly 2 or more. I mean, the more the merrier, really, in terms of like distinguished sounds which you instantly would make it different from any other track, or you could put a spin on a classic sample. And for me in this track, I wanted the lead sound to be this horn, sort of trumpet. Not sure exactly what instrument it is, but I sort of stretched a sample I had from some old sample CD, and I stretched it in time, and then I grabbed another little bit and sort of formed this call and response sort of lead. And that sound wouldn't have worked in the way in which it did without the effects. So I'll talk about that a little bit as well. So without the effects, this is what it sounds like. So there was a little bit of reverb or something going on just in the initial sample, but I wanted to wet it up a bit. I wanted to sort of make it more atmospheric and more ambient. And using a flanger can be a good way to sort of place sounds sort of slightly backwards in the mix, slightly to the side, give it a little bit of width, a little bit of sort of texture, separate it from other sounds a little bit. So I've got that on to start it off. Relatively wet with the flanger, quite distinctive. And then the delay is really where the sound comes alive as it connects the dots. Because without delay, it's too much space in between the sounds, but because I've got it once every 4 bars, or sort of the call and then response 4 bars later, it's important to sort of fill out the sounds or fill out the space in between the sounds. So the delay, high feedback, not super high, sort of a moderate wet level, filtered with a low pass filter, but any form of filtering can be cool. Have a play around with that. I like an offbeat sort of a dubbed out, dotted sort of a delay time, and a little bit of sort of stereo widening. And then next up we've got Camel Fat, which has got just a little bit of tube on and quite a bit of compression. Compression can be quite useful to sort of bring up quieter sounds in the mix in the same way as which it can be useful to sort of tame louder sounds in the mix. Nice one. And then just at the end, a little bit of reverb, moderate wet level, fruity stock reverb in this situation. So nothing too complicated, but each effect has been used for a purpose to sort of fill out the sound a little bit and give it a bit of excitement. Yeah, so that is what I wanted to be the lead sound of the track. But as per the arrangement, I didn't want to have it in absolutely everywhere in the tune. I wanted it to be in there a lot because I think I wanted that to be a common theme of the track. But if you use it absolutely everywhere, you can get sick of it. So I thought I'd introduce it 16 bars in alongside the pad, and then I wouldn't later on when it's used throughout the most of the track, it's used every 8 bars, and then the call and response is every 4 bars. So I thought, right, well, I'll sort of tease it in the intro, and you can be useful to do that with sounds. You can either, or additionally, you could have automated them, you could have reversed them, you could have created another version of it which is slightly different, or you could have grabbed, say, just one of the notes and then just you let the delay can have a different sound profile when you sort of have different parts of it, which so always have a play around with different parts of a sound with the same delay processing. But yeah, I ended up using it in its entirety, just a little bit less often, and then I brought the response in a little bit later. And so that sort of guided the track in terms of like a distinguishing sort of element. Pads can be really useful either as a background layer or as to sort of be the lead sound in certain tracks, but pads are a really important part of Atmospheric Jungle. In this case, I had a pad which sounded like this. You can make your own pads, or you can find sounds and stretch them and sort of dub them out to create your own sound, your own pads. And that's sort of what I did in this case. Or at least I found the pad which I liked the texture of and I thought would work well with the other sounds in my track. Processing wise, just a tiny little top end boost at 7.5k. Chorus is really nice for adding a bit of width to your sound. It works nice on vocals, pads, arpeggios, melodies. Or try out chorus on basic anything if you want a little bit of width and sort of excitement. Don't go too far with it on certain sounds because it can make the pitch perceived as being slightly off, but it works by detuning different voices. But really cool to sort of add a bit of width and a bit of texture sounds, similar to a flanger, but this is a slightly different sort of tonality. But yeah, I used it to give it a bit of width to this pad, and I had a little bit of delay on, and I used a different delay time. This was slightly slower and non-dotted, and it sort of just filled out the gaps. It let the pad last just a little bit longer. I did use a tiny bit of volume automation just to shape the envelope of the pad, because sometimes pads can be a little bit too long-winded, or in this case, you don't want them to be, sometimes you want them to not have a transient at all, so I sort of made sure of that by fading in the start, and then I faded out the end as well, and the delay just sort of connected the dots. So nice and smooth, really. And then I had a little bit of multiband compression on. I'm not sure if I was actually using it for compression. Sometimes I use multiband compressors as an EQ or for stereo imaging control, like this plugin in FL Maximus does. So I was putting 200 hertz and below in mono, a trick I just tend to do all the time, just a habit really, for mono compatibility. And I boosted the high frequencies by an additional couple of dB, just to sort of let the tops breathe a little bit. You don't? Right, oh yeah, so they are the core melodic parts of the track, and they form the basis of the vibe of the tune. But it's good to have sort of contrasting sections, new melodic sounds. Sometimes they don't work with the existing sounds, or they need more room to breathe, so you can have them in different sections. So that factors into the story of the tune and the arrangement. So how I sort of developed the arrangement in this track was I took out the lead sort of horn sounds briefly in the middle of the track, and I kept the pad in for a bit because I think that was sort of like the common theme. And when so at the start I had the call part of the horn, and then the response came in later. I thought, okay, well, I'll switch it up, and I'll have, when it does sort of get teased back in, I'll do the response, and then it can go back into the call and response. But how I sort of had the contrasting middle section of the track, I'll just give that a little play here. Okay, so what you notice in there is it's very distinctly different from. So it's useful if you've, because it means when you do return to the core part of the sort of track, drop wise, it's a bit more refreshing, and you can makes you sort of appreciate them both. And so having changes with common themes can sort of be nice in atmospheric jungle tunes. So yeah, so how I ended up in this contrasting sort of middle section is I used the drums which I had in the intro. So I had an amen. I wanted to bring the amen out of nowhere, as I wanted the drop to have a little bit of impact to it, as well as keeping it quite atmospheric overall, because I sort of took some inspiration for this track from sort of like the mid to late noughties sort of liquid sound, with the bass line predominantly, and I'll get to that a little later on. But yeah, so amen for the drop. This break is the intro break. I went to town a little bit with chopping that up from the traditional sort of groove, because this, I'm not sure what the official name of this break is, but I just think of it as the open hat type break. Yeah, so this is how it sounds unchopped. Oops. That's traditionally how you hear it, but I thought I'd sort of spin the groove of it a little bit and create something a little bit more jungly perhaps, or a little bit more steppy. And then, yeah, so for the middle of a track, I thought I'd bring that groove back, and I'd keep the pad, have a new vocal come in, lose the horn, keep the bass notes, but change the bass sound. So I had a bass wobble prior to that. So typically, atmospheric jungle will have more of an 808 type bass, most predominantly, or just like a held signed sub. But yeah, so I thought I'd do a little spin on the classic theme by having a slightly atypical bass sound. So I took a liquid wobble style sort of a bass, and that sort of was another little sort of unique selling point perhaps of this tune. Yeah, so let's take a quick look. So I made that in Serum, and I followed a video tutorial on how to follow. If you check out how to make a liquid bubble bass, there's a great video of someone breaking out how to do it. But essentially, it's just two sine oscillators, one of them an octave higher with a fifth or 7 semitones up on one of them, and that forms the basis of the sound alongside the movement, which is linked in LFO 1 on a quarter note T. Quite relatively simple to do. Definitely check out the video if you're interested in making that sound. And yeah, so this was the notes I had for this: A, F, G, A. I'm in a higher F. I chopped off the little G at the end of the 16-bar phrase. And yeah, I thought it would sort of be texturally contrasting to have a similar bass line, but then in just a held sub as opposed to a sub wobble. I think I just ran it through the same channel. I'll check out some of the notes. But essentially it's very similar, but it has a different quality to it because it's got less low mids in. So it sort of changes it has a contrasting texture to it. And yeah, so I think when you combine that with the vocal and the change in drums, it sort of creates a familiar yet different section of the tune. And yeah, that formed a nice contrasting middle section, and then you could return to the amen horn section again without it sounding like you're sick of it. And then for the final section, I thought I'd switch it up slightly again. I liked the sort of back and forth of 32 bars of amen and horn and the liquid bass, and then 32 bars of the intro break with just the normal sub. But I thought it might be nice in the spirit of atmospheric sort of jungle to get in a new sort of melodic sound to sign off the tune, finish the story of the tune, so to speak. But so I came up with this sound. I think I found a little FX sound and I reversed it put a bunch of delay on and stuff, and then made one which was stretched out or pitched down by an octave, just to have. I wanted to keep the call and response theme. Let's just have a listen to that sound. Sounds a bit like something out of Stranger Things. And yeah, but that didn't really sound how I wanted it to. It didn't really layer that well over the pad for some reason. Yeah, so, and the horn, so I thought I'd keep the drums, keep the bass, roll out the outro with a new melodic sound, and it's sort of it's like a signpost to sign off the tune, which can be nice to have. Nice, okie doke, yeah. And so that's the story of the track, and I've talked a little bit about why I chose certain sounds and the reasoning for that. But I thought I'd talk a little bit more about the drums, the amen on the drop, as oftentimes the amen break is an amazing break for many different reasons, and it's used popularly throughout many different styles, but definitely jungle and atmospheric jungle it equally pitches in and has done since its inception. Okay, so let's have a little look at the amen here. One thing to note when you are working with drums, especially something like the amen, is how you chop it can sort of dictate the groove of the track or that section of the track. Like, more choppage generally equals more energy, and if that's what you want, like a more energetic, maybe club orientated track, then that's what you're going to get. Less choppage, maybe a little bit less clubby, maybe. It's all about marrying the elements together. So my sort of thought process going into this Amen was, right, I'm going to chop it a bit, but not too much. And so this is what I started off with. I chose one, I found an Amen from an old 90s sample CD because I wanted one with sort of that old grit. I'm pretty sure this sounds a bit like a Amen I've heard in an old PFM tune, so I wouldn't be surprised if it's the exact same one he used from that sample CD. But yeah, so it can be useful to find version, as much as there's loads of ways to get amens other than that. Sometimes it can be fun hunting for certain versions of certain breaks for a certain sonic quality, a certain groove. It might have gone through certain processing or hardware outboard gear, giving them a certain sound. So that's what I was after, and this is what it sounded like in its initial state. Okay, and then I thought I'd chop it up to give it a slightly different groove with some different fills and section, trying to use the crash a little bit differently. Yeah, so my sort of approach when doing jungle drums in any sort of style is just thinking about the core groove you want, so which is going to be repeated the most. And what that for me was in this tune was kick on the 1, snare on the 2, the 2-step kick in the traditional place you would have it, but then instead of having the snare there, push the snare back to have it on the offbeat. And so I was sort of keeping that groove by, instead of repeating it with a snare, I thought, okay, well, I'll switch it up, make a minor edit at the end of the 2-bar phrase with a crash. And then repeats again, back to what it was on the 1, and then have a change at the end of the 4-bar phrase. So you're working in terms of even numbers. So it's like tiny little change there, more significant change at the end of the 4-bar, and then repeat that, but then at the end of the 8-bar groove, you've got a different one again, and then you get to the end of a 16, different one again. So it's sort of the most important sections in terms of little switch ups are 4, 8, 16, and you can recommend. If I was going for a more clubby orientated Amen sort of choppage, like I've done in certain other tunes of mine, like Internal and Wojciech. They've got loads of extra details, like here. But basically, it's very drum led, whereas this one was less drum led. But I think it's still important to get some drum, a little bit of drum sort of editing can go a long way. Like even if you just had literally like a 2-step repeated sort of a Amen groove, like I just. Just tiny little changes. Even if you just repeated that, your brain notices the little differences, and it keeps it from getting bored. Yes, those are the drums, and I had a little bit of flanger automation just to sort of differentiate the end section, and a little bit of delay to sort of connect the sections. And that delay sort of layers nicely over into when the break comes back in. Okie doke. Yeah, and so the final thing when you're wrapping up, or the final piece of the puzzle with atmospheric jungle tracks, or tracks of most styles really, is the little details, the effects, and the sort of texture layers, building up the sort of icing on the cake, so to speak. So for me in this track, there's a few which sort of very much satisfied what I was looking for. One of them was just this effects, which was really wide, and the rest of the track wasn't that wide, although because I wanted to keep it to the 90s sort of style and sort of aesthetic and feel, which they aren't overly bright and aren't overly wide, but I wanted to have a nice meeting point, which was a little bit wide, some brightness in there. or richness in the tops. But this sound was from a modern some modern pack, but I liked the way it sort of lied nicely upon the track, and you could sort of use it as a bit of ear candy, almost as like same way I was deploying the horns to sort of, there's a bit of rhythmic value to it as well. I like the way it sort of added a bit of pronunciation to certain parts of the track and filled it out nicely, and quite an airy sort of a sound. And yeah, so that's used a few times throughout the track, more so in the intro, but a little bit later on as well. The second effects, these are all relatively quiet in the mix as well, sort of ear candy stuff. I reversed this sound and sort of played around with the volume movement on it, so that it just led in, sort of signposted when the drop was coming, basically. Tiny little bit of delay on filter delay. Nothing too complicated, but those little things, I wouldn't overuse them. Like, I specifically didn't use it until the drop came in, so that it was like, oh, what's that? Like, it's sort of, because the Amen was coming out of nowhere, I sort of wanted to have a little bit of preamble, a little sort of, like a very short sort of build up, so to speak, or sort of just a signpost. And I used that only a couple more times throughout the track. To differentiate it with when the Amen came back in for like the second Amen appearance, I took a bit of the Apache break and reversed that, just to give another little signpost that the second drop was coming, or just to sort of another little piece of ear candy. And I used a slightly different groove on the first part of when the Amen returns, just to sort of add a bit of variation as well. And then one of the final little bits and bobs is a texture layer. It can either be a long, drawn out sort of recording of like a cityscape, or like someone's recorded like the sea, like waves or a storm. You can find a lot of good stuff on a website called freesound.org. That's where I got a lot of these sounds from. This one I think was just from some random sample pack somewhere. But I was looking through and I was listening. I was like, right, vinyl, sort of long vinyl recordings can work cool. But I found this sort of chimey sound, which sort of had quite a bit of stereo width to it. And I thought it would lie quite nicely over certain parts of the track, like the intro, to give it a bit more texture, a bit more ambience. Okay, so let's have a little listen to that. Second. And I automated that in to be quieter, and I added a little quiet initially and then get louder, and then sort of dubbed it out with some delay going into the breakdown sections, and then when I brought it in at the end of the tune. It's quite a strange sound when you listen to it by itself, but the texture sounds are almost not meant to be distinguishable. They're sort of like just complete the vibe of the track without standing out. They're meant to be in the background, but they honestly do add a lot to sort of how your ears perceive the track. Leading neatly into the breakdown. Now, this isn't a particularly complicated tune, but I don't think atmospheric jungle tracks or tracks of any style necessarily need to be. I think if you've got the right sounds together, then that's basically half the battle. And it definitely helps with the mix down as well, and the overall sort of coherence of the song. Like, the mix down on this tune isn't particularly complicated. I think I've just tried to gain stage and keep everything relatively. I generally tend to find myself having the drums at the forefront, the bass ever so slightly sort of second, and then the other sounds sitting neatly behind it at the appropriate levels. Got a little bit of compression on the drums bus. I think a lot of it was just finding the right Amen to do the tune with. Like other times I'll have loads more Amen processing on the channel and on the drums bus, but this one already sounded quite nice as is. And just using a little bit of this supercharger plugin to compress it, add a bit of saturation as well. Yeah, nothing too significant. Little bit of fresh air to brighten up the music. I've grouped all the musical sounds, mainly the pad and the horn and the ARP section at the end. They're all getting a little bit of top end boosting, and they're getting side chained a little bit to the drums bus. And I think the bass is getting a little bit of side chaining as well. I quite like the 2 or the 3 if you're in FL using side chaining via the Fruity limiter. Be quite nice, and that is linked, yeah, just to the drums bus. The more jungle you do in, the less side chaining from drums to bass I find you can get away with. In this case, it's about 3 or 4 dB, which is more than I was thinking it was going to be. But yeah, I would say 1, 2, 3 dB is typically what I think works well when side chaining kick to bass or break to bass, drums bus to bass in jungle tunes. But you can definitely push it a lot more in other styles and more modern sounding sort of takes. And yeah, that is the bulk of this tune. A lot of the processing crops up on channels in a slightly different way. Like I mentioned, chorus and flanger, they pop up again on the vocal channel. Delay, reverb. A lot of the sort of processing is relatively similar, which gives it that sort of cohesive feel. And they all the sounds sound like they're cut from the same cloth, which I think is a really important part of making atmospheric jungle. But yeah, hope you found this useful. If you got any questions or suggestions for future videos, just pop something in the comments. Nice one.